Imagine being trapped in a marriage with no way out. What if your only escape was deemed an unforgivable sin and society itself stood as your jailer? Picture a time, specifically 1178, when a woman's fate was sealed the moment she said, "I do." Number 9. The Church's iron grip on holy matrimony. Picture this, the year is 1178. The very air you breathe, the ground you walk on, the laws that govern your life, are all deeply intertwined with the colossal, unwavering power of the Church. This wasn't just a building where people gathered on Sundays. It was the ultimate authority, the moral compass, and the legal bedrock of pretty much everything. And nowhere was its influence felt more profoundly than in the sacred institution of marriage. For women living in the medieval world, this meant that seeking an exit from a troubled marriage wasn't just difficult. It was nearly impossible because the Church deemed marriage a sacrament, a holy union, a bond forged in heaven and therefore utterly unbreakable on earth. Think about it. In your world today, marriage might be a beautiful commitment, but it is also a legal contract that can, under certain circumstances, be dissolved. Not so in 1178. Back then, the Church taught that marriage was one of the 7 sacraments, divine gifts instituted by Christ himself. It was right up there with baptism and communion. This wasn't some human agreement. It was a mystical joining of 2 souls, blessed by God and intended to last until death. Famous passage from the Gospel of Matthew, "What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate," wasn't just a suggestion. It was an absolute command, a law etched into the very foundation of medieval society. Church, as God's representative on earth, enforced this law with an iron fist. This deeply held belief meant there was no such thing as divorce in the modern sense. Couldn't just decide you weren't happy anymore and go your separate ways. The idea of dissolving a holy bond that God himself had supposedly created was, in the eyes of the Church, a profound sacrilege, a direct defiance of divine will. Couples separated, even informally, they were still considered married in the eyes of God and the Church. Any attempt to remarry while a previous spouse was still alive was considered adultery, a grave sin that could lead to excommunication, a terrifying punishment that severed you from the Church, from God's grace, and from society itself. Imagine being cast out, shunned by everyone you knew, denied the sacraments, and told your soul was condemned. That was the very real threat hanging over anyone who dared to defy the Church's doctrine on marriage. The Church's legal system, known as canon law, was incredibly sophisticated for its time, and it governed all matters related to marriage. Ecclesiastical courts, staffed by learned clerics, heard cases concerning marital disputes, but their purpose was rarely to grant what we would call a divorce. Instead, they focused on 2 main outcomes: reconciliation, attempting to compel the couple to live together again, or, in very rare and specific circumstances, granting an annulment. It is crucial to understand the difference. A divorce dissolves a valid marriage. An annulment, on the other hand, declared that a valid marriage never actually existed in the first place. It was as if the marriage had never happened, a legal declaration that one of the essential elements required for a true, sacramentally valid union had been missing from the start. This distinction was absolutely vital. If a marriage was annulled, it meant that the parties were free to remarry, because, legally and spiritually, they had never truly been married before. Proving that a marriage was never valid was an incredibly high bar, requiring proof of a fundamental impediment that existed at the time of the wedding. It wasn't about whether you were happy or whether your spouse was a terrible person. It was about whether the marriage ceremony itself was flawed, or if the parties were legally incapable of entering into a valid union. Grounds for annulment were incredibly narrow, things like consanguinity, being too closely related by blood, pre-contract, one party was already legally bound to someone else, or impotence, the inability to consummate the marriage. These were not easy things to prove, especially for a woman who had little power or agency. The Church's authority was not just theoretical. It was enforced through a powerful network of bishops, priests, and ecclesiastical courts that reached into every corner of medieval life. Priests often served as moral watchdogs in their communities, aware of marital disputes and quick to remind parishioners of their sacred vow. Pope, as the supreme head of the Church, held ultimate authority, and appeals from lower courts could be sent all the way to Rome, a journey that was incredibly costly, time-consuming, and nearly impossible for the average person, especially a woman. For a woman in 1178, the Church's teaching on marriage meant that her marital status was, in most cases, a life sentence. Her identity, her social standing, and her economic security were almost entirely tied to her husband. Even contemplate separating, let alone divorcing, was to invite not just social condemnation, but also spiritual damnation. Teachings were clear, the consequences dire, and the path to freedom virtually non-existent, all because the Church held the unbreakable bond of holy matrimony in its absolute, unwavering grip. This theological foundation was the first, and perhaps most formidable, barrier to a woman's escape from an unhappy or abusive marriage. Number 8, the near absence of divorce as we know it. Imagine this, you're living in 1178, and the very concept of divorce, as a straightforward legal process to end a marriage, simply doesn't exist. It's not just difficult to get, it's practically an alien idea. Your understanding of marriage is shaped by the Church, which, as we discussed, views it as an unbreakable sacrament. This means that if you're a woman trapped in a terrible marriage, your options are so limited they barely register as options at all. You can't just hire a lawyer and file papers to end the union. The legal framework for such a thing was simply not in place. The legal system of the medieval world, particularly concerning marriage, was dominated by canon law, the law of the Church. Unlike modern civil law systems, which often distinguish between legal separation and divorce, canon law maintained the sanctity and permanence of the marital bond with extraordinary rigor. The only recognized method for dissolving a marriage was not a divorce but an annulment. And an annulment was not a declaration that a marriage was ending. It was a declaration that a marriage had, from its very beginning, never truly existed in the eyes of God and the Church. This distinction is crucial, and it dramatically narrowed the pathways for any woman seeking to escape a marriage. To get an annulment, you had to prove a fundamental defect or impediment that existed at the moment the marriage vows were exchanged. Think about that for a second. You weren't arguing that your husband was cruel, or that you were desperately unhappy, or that he was squandering your dowry. Those were not grounds. Instead, you had to demonstrate that something was so fundamentally wrong from the start that the union was never truly valid. The accepted grounds for annulment were remarkably specific and incredibly difficult to prove, especially for a woman with limited access to information, resources, or legal counsel. One of the most frequently cited, though still rare, grounds was consanguinity, meaning the couple was too closely related by blood. The Church had very strict rules about who could marry whom, extending to surprisingly distant cousins. If it could be proven that the bride and groom were within these prohibited degrees of kinship, then the marriage was declared null and void. However, proving this often required extensive genealogical research, tracing family trees, and gathering testimony from elders who remembered distant relatives. Imagine trying to do that without official birth records, easy travel, or professional investigators, especially if your family was not of noble birth with meticulously kept lineages. Another ground was pre-contract. This meant that one of the parties was already secretly engaged or married to someone else at the time of the current wedding. While this sounds like a clear-cut case, proving a secret pre-contract could be nearly impossible. It relied on witnesses to a private agreement or the discovery of clandestine vows. Often, such agreements were verbal, made in private, and the person who made the pre-contract had every incentive to deny it. A woman alleging this would face skepticism and the immense challenge of finding credible witnesses who could corroborate her story. Then there was impotence. This was a particularly tricky and humiliating ground for annulment, especially for women. If a husband was unable to consummate the marriage, the Church considered the marriage invalid, as consummation was seen as essential for the full expression of the marital sacrament. However, proving impotence often required a physical examination of the husband, sometimes by women appointed by the court, and testimony regarding the couple's intimate life. Imagine the public scrutiny, the shame, and the sheer invasiveness of such a process for a woman living in a time when modesty and privacy were paramount. Furthermore, it often led to the wife being blamed for the husband's inadequacy or being accused of making false claims. The husband claimed he could consummate but simply wouldn't with his wife, proving otherwise was incredibly difficult. Duress was another potential, though rarely successful, ground. It could be shown that one party was forced into the marriage against their true will, perhaps through coercion or threat. An annulment might be granted. But again, proving true coercion rather than simply parental pressure or social expectation was a monumental task. The burden of proof was entirely on the person seeking the annulment, and medieval courts were highly skeptical of claims that seemed to challenge established social norms. A woman, in particular, was often expected to defer to the will of her father or male guardians, and claiming she was forced into a marriage might be seen as an act of rebellion rather than a legitimate legal complaint. Fraud, though even rarer, might also be a ground if one party had deliberately misrepresented a fundamental fact, like their social standing or whether they were already married. This had to be a significant, foundational fraud, not just a lie about wealth or character. Again, proving deceit and its impact on the validity of the vows was incredibly complex. The Church's rigorous adherence to these narrow grounds meant that the vast majority of women, even those in truly dire or abusive marriages, had no legal recourse. Their marriages, however unhappy, were considered valid and unbreakable. The system was designed to uphold the permanence of marriage, not to provide an escape route. For women, this meant a life sentence within their chosen or unchosen union, with no legal avenue for release. The absence of divorce as a concept, replaced instead by the near mythical annulment, was a towering wall against any woman's hope for freedom or a new beginning. Number 7. The economic quicksand of marital separation. Imagine being in 1178, caught in a marriage you desperately want to escape. Now layer on top of all the legal and spiritual barriers the crushing weight of economic reality. For most women in medieval society, seeking any form of separation, even an informal one, was tantamount to stepping into a pit of financial quicksand. They risked not only losing their social standing, but also their very means of survival. This economic dependence was a silent, powerful force that kept women bound to their marriages, regardless of how unhappy or even dangerous those unions became. At the heart of this economic dilemma was the concept of the dowry. When a woman married, her family was expected to provide a dowry to her husband. This dowry, which could consist of land, money, goods, or even services, was not a gift to the bride. It was a payment to the groom and his family. In theory, it was meant to help support the wife within her new household and provide for her during widowhood. In practice, however, once the dowry was transferred, it often became absorbed into the husband's family's assets. He had considerable control over it, and his family benefited directly from it. If a woman tried to separate from her husband, even if she managed to secure a rare annulment or a separation from bed and board, meaning they lived apart but were still married, the fate of her dowry was precarious. In many cases, the husband and his family had no legal obligation to return the dowry. After all, the marriage had taken place, and the dowry was the consideration for that union. Imagine then a woman stripped of her most valuable asset, the very wealth that secured her place in the world. Without her dowry, she had nothing. She could not purchase land, she had no independent income, and she certainly couldn't support herself. She would be utterly destitute. Beyond the dowry, a woman's property rights were severely limited. Upon marriage, a legal concept known as coverture became effective. This meant that a woman's legal identity became subsumed into that of her husband. She could not own property independently, enter into contracts, or sue or be sued in court without her husband's consent or involvement. Any property she brought into the marriage, or inherited during it, generally fell under her husband's control. He managed it, he made decisions about it, and he benefited from its income. So if a woman left her husband, she was essentially leaving behind everything she might have considered hers. She would have no claim to the family home, no access to shared resources, and no legal standing to demand support. Even if her family was wealthy, they might be reluctant to take her back. A separated or annulled woman was a burden, a drain on resources, and a source of shame. Her family had already paid the dowry, and they might not have the means or the desire to support her indefinitely. Furthermore, taking her back could damage the family's reputation and their prospects for marrying off other daughters. Consider the practical implications for an ordinary woman. If she was a peasant or a commoner, her life was tied to the land and the household economy. Her work was integral to the functioning of the farm or the craft. If she left her husband, she lost her home, her livelihood, and her role in the community's economic structure. She had no independent profession she could easily pursue. Women of this era had very few avenues for earning a living outside of marriage. domestic service for wealthy households, very low-paid agricultural labor, or, in desperate circumstances, begging. None of these offered security or dignity. Even for women of higher social standing, such as those from noble families, the economic consequences were severe. While a noblewoman might have some personal belongings or rights to a dower, a portion of her husband's estate set aside for her if she became a widow, these were contingent on her remaining married or on her husband's death. If she abandoned her husband, she risked losing her access to these resources. Family might take her back, but she would likely live under the patronage of a male relative, stripped of her status as mistress of her own household. Children further complicated the economic landscape. Children were almost always considered part of the father's lineage and property. If a woman left her husband, she would almost certainly lose custody of her children. Not only was this emotionally devastating, but it also meant she had no claim to the economic support that children might eventually provide in their labor, and no stake in the family's future prosperity through their inheritance. This added another layer of emotional and financial deterrence for any woman contemplating departure. The stark reality was this: for a woman in 1178, marriage offered the only path to economic stability, social standing, and a recognized place in society. To abandon that union was to risk utter destitution, to become a pauper, dependent on the charity of others, or worse, to fall into a life of extreme poverty and disrepute. Financial stakes were simply too high for most women to ever consider, let alone pursue, a path that led away from their husbands. This economic quicksand was a powerful, silent barrier that ensured most women remained trapped in their marriages, even when their hearts and their bodies cried out for release. Number 6, the shadow of social ruin and public shame. Imagine the social landscape of 1178, a world where reputation wasn't just important, it was everything. Your standing in the community, your family's honor, and your very identity were inextricably linked to how you were perceived by others. For a woman, this meant that the pursuit of any form of marital separation, even a rare annulment, cast a long, dark shadow of social ruin and public shame. Fear of ostracism, of being a pariah, was a powerful deterrent that kept most women bound to their unhappy marriages, far more effectively than any legal decree. In medieval society, a woman's virtue and modesty were highly prized. The primary role was seen as a wife and mother, maintaining the household and raising children. Marriage was not just a personal union, it was a foundational pillar of the community, a way to establish alliances, consolidate property, and ensure the continuation of family lines. To break that bond, or even to appear to try to break it, was seen as an affront to social order, a challenge to established norms, and a source of grave dishonor. Consider the whisper. If a woman even hinted at seeking a separation, or if rumors began to circulate about discord in her marriage, the judgment would be swift and merciless. People would speculate about her character, questioning her obedience, her piety, and her devotion to her husband. She might be seen as difficult, rebellious, or even unchaste, regardless of the true circumstances of her marriage. In a small, tightly knit community, where everyone knew everyone else's business, such whispers could destroy a reputation in an instant. If a woman actually managed to secure an annulment, even though it legally declared the marriage never existed, the social stigma often remained. People might not fully understand the nuanced legal distinction between an annulment and a modern divorce. They would only see that a woman had left her husband or that her marriage had failed. This could lead to her being viewed with suspicion as someone who was somehow defective or unmarriageable. Family might also face social repercussions, as their daughter's annulment could reflect poorly on their honor and affect the marriage prospects of other siblings. Think about the consequences for a woman's future. If she was no longer married, or if her marriage had been annulled, her chances of remarrying, especially into a respectable family, plummeted. Who would want to take on a woman who had been returned, or whose marital history was tainted? Even if she was technically free to marry after an annulment, her social market value would be severely diminished. This was particularly devastating in a society where marriage was almost the sole avenue for a woman's security and social standing. Beyond formal annulment, even a simple physical separation, where a woman might return to her parents' home, would invite intense scrutiny and judgment. Such an act was seen as a grave dereliction of her wifely duties, a defiance of God's will, and a source of profound shame for both her and her family. She would be seen as having abandoned her husband and her home, and her very chastity might be questioned. This was a world where a woman's honor was intertwined with her husband's, and a separation could tarnish both. Imagine walking through your village knowing that every eye was upon you, every glance filled with judgment, every conversation whispered behind cupped hands. You might be excluded from social gatherings, your children might be ostracized, and your family's standing might suffer. This wasn't just unpleasant, it was a form of social death, a terrifying prospect that could leave a woman isolated and without support in a world where community ties were essential for survival. Examples of social ostracism, even if informal, were common. A woman might find herself excluded from women's communal activities, denied customary courtesies, or be the subject of gossip and ridicule. Her integrity could be questioned, and her ability to manage a household or raise children might be undermined. Such social pressure was a powerful force, often more effective than any legal threat, in keeping women compliant and within their prescribed roles. The fear of public shame extended to the woman's family as well. Family's reputation was crucial for forging alliances, securing marriages for other children, and maintaining their social standing. A daughter who sought separation, or whose marriage was annulled, brought dishonor upon her kin, potentially jeopardizing the family's future prospects. This meant that even a sympathetic family might discourage a woman from pursuing separation, not out of malice, but out of a desperate need to protect their collective standing. So for a woman in 1178, the decision to seek an end to her marriage was not just a legal battle, it was a perilous journey into a social minefield. Potential for social ruin, for being shunned, shamed, and rendered an outcast, was a formidable deterrent. This fear of ostracism, of becoming a pariah in her own community, ensured that the vast majority of women, no matter how desperate their circumstances, remained trapped in their marriages, preferring the known misery of their situation to the unknown, terrifying abyss of social condemnation. The shadow of shame was long, and it cast a chilling effect on any woman who dared to dream of freedom. Number 5. The unyielding structure of a patriarchal world. Imagine stepping back into 1178, into a world where the very air you breathe reinforces the idea that men are inherently superior to women. This isn't just a cultural norm, it's the foundational bedrock of society, deeply embedded in law, custom, and religious teaching. This unyielding patriarchal structure was perhaps the most pervasive and insidious hurdle for any woman seeking to escape a marriage. In such a world, women were largely considered the property of men, first of their fathers, then of their husbands, leaving them with virtually no independent legal identity or voice. From the moment a girl was born, her life was shaped by male authority. Father held legal control over her, making all significant decisions regarding her upbringing, her education, which was often minimal and limited to domestic skills, and most importantly, her marriage. Daughters were often seen as assets, tools for forging alliances, securing land, or enhancing family prestige through strategic marriages. A woman's consent to marriage, if sought at all, was often a mere formality, expected to follow her father's wishes. The idea of a woman choosing her own path, let alone challenging a union chosen for her, was almost unthinkable. Once married, a woman transitioned from her father's authority to her husband's. The legal concept of coverture meant that her separate legal existence effectively ceased. Her husband became her legal representative in all matters. She could not own property in her own name, sign contracts, initiate lawsuits, or conduct business independently. Any land or wealth she brought into the marriage through a dowry came under her husband's control. Her earnings, if she had any, were legally his. She was, in essence, a dependent, legally incapable of self-governance. This meant that if a woman wished to seek a separation or annulment, she couldn't simply walk into a court and state her case. She often needed her husband's permission, or at the very least, a male relative, like her father or brother, assuming they were sympathetic and willing to risk their own standing to represent her. This immediately put her at a profound disadvantage. Her husband, who held all the legal power, was unlikely to cooperate in a process that would undermine his authority and potentially strip him of his wife's dowry or service. The very notion of a woman making demands, particularly legal ones, was seen as an act of defiance against the natural order. Religious texts and influential scholars of the time often emphasized female submission and obedience to male authority. St. Paul's letters, widely influential, stated, "Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands, as unto the Lord." This was interpreted not just as spiritual guidance, but as a blueprint for social conduct. A woman who challenged her husband, even in a legal setting, risked being seen as rebellious, ungodly, and a threat to the stability of the family unit. The courts themselves were entirely male-dominated. Judges, lawyers, though not in the modern sense, and even witnesses were predominantly men. A woman appearing in court would face a panel of men who likely held deeply ingrained beliefs about female subservience and male headship. Testimony might be viewed with skepticism, her emotional distress dismissed, and her claims easily doubted against the word of her husband. She had no female advocates, no support groups, and no one in authority who fundamentally understood her experience from a woman's perspective. Furthermore, the patriarchal structure extended to public perception and social expectations. A woman's honor was tied to her husband's. If she left him, or tried to, it wasn't just her reputation that suffered. It was also a perceived blow to her husband's authority and masculinity. He might accuse her of desertion, insubordination, or even infidelity to protect his own standing. These accusations, easily believed in a male-dominated society, would further undermine her case and her social position. Even within her own family, a woman might find little support if she sought to challenge her marriage. Her family, having already invested a dowry and secured a match, would likely prioritize maintaining the family's honor and alliances over their daughter's individual happiness. A returned daughter, or one who challenged her husband, was a liability, a source of shame, and an economic burden. They might pressure her to remain in the marriage, even if it was abusive or unhappy, to preserve the family's reputation and avoid further financial and social entanglement. The lack of female independent agency meant that a woman had no power to initiate economic change, to secure her own living, or to protect herself. She couldn't unilaterally decide to move away, acquire property, or earn a sufficient income to live independently. Her entire existence was framed within the context of male guardianship and authority. In essence, the patriarchal world of 1178 created an invisible cage for women, one reinforced by law, custom, and belief. It stripped them of legal personhood, economic independence, and social voice. Any attempt to break free from a marriage was not just a legal challenge, it was a challenge to the entire social order, a defiance of deeply entrenched male authority. This unyielding structure ensured that for most women, marriage was a permanent state, because the very system designed to govern their lives was designed to keep them firmly in their place, under the control of men. Number 4, proving the unprovable, the burden of evidence. Imagine you're a woman in 1178, and you've somehow managed to navigate the spiritual, economic, and social minefields to even consider seeking an annulment. Now you face perhaps the most frustrating hurdle of all, the monumental, often impossible, burden of proof. The very specific and narrow grounds for annulment meant you weren't just telling your story. You had to produce concrete, undeniable evidence for things that were frequently private, intangible, or difficult to ascertain in an era without modern forensics or investigative techniques. The system, in essence, asked you to prove the unprovable. As established, an annulment required proof of a fundamental impediment that existed at the time of the marriage. This was not about post-marital behavior, no matter how egregious. It was about invalidating the very vows exchanged. The most common grounds were consanguinity, blood relation, pre-contract, a prior secret marriage or engagement, or impotence. Each of these presented a unique and often insurmountable evidentiary challenge for a woman. Let's take consanguinity. While it seems straightforward, proving that you and your husband were within the prohibited degrees of kinship was immensely complicated. This wasn't a world of meticulously kept birth certificates and national archives. Genealogical records, particularly for common folk, were often non-existent or patchy. You might need to rely on the oral testimony of elderly relatives, perhaps long deceased, or distant family members who might have forgotten details or be unwilling to testify. Imagine trying to trace several generations of family history through word of mouth, especially if one side of the family lived far away or was uncooperative. The burden was on the woman to definitively prove these complex family trees, a task that was often beyond her resources, knowledge, or travel capabilities. Then consider pre-contract. This involved proving that either you or your husband had already made a binding marriage vow to someone else before your current marriage. These prior vows were often made informally, perhaps even in secret, relying on verbal agreements and private witnesses. How do you find and compel witnesses to a clandestine promise made years ago? What if the person who made the prior contract denied it vehemently? A woman alleging this would likely face accusations of slander or attempting to break her marriage for selfish reasons. Court would demand concrete proof, not just suspicion or rumor, and such proof was incredibly difficult to acquire. The person who stood to lose from the revelation of a pre-contract had every incentive to lie and deny, and without compelling outside corroboration, the woman's claim would likely fail. Perhaps the most humiliating and difficult ground to prove was impotence. This involved proving that the husband was physically unable to consummate the marriage. This was not a subjective claim. It required objective proof of a physical incapacity. Medieval courts often resorted to intrusive methods, including the examination of the husband by a panel of midwives or other women, or even a physical inspection by male doctors. Imagine the shame and public scrutiny for both parties, particularly the wife, who would have to testify about the most intimate details of her marital bed. Furthermore, impotence could be inconsistent, or temporary, or even feigned. A husband might claim he was perfectly capable, but simply refused to perform his conjugal duties with his wife. How could a woman, without medical expertise or the power to compel repeated examinations, conclusively prove a chronic, unresolvable inability to consummate? The burden of proof in these cases was exceptionally high, and the process itself was deeply invasive and embarrassing. Beyond these specific grounds, there was the general difficulty of evidence gathering in the 12th century. There were no police forces to investigate, no legal aid organizations to assist in gathering documents, and no easy way to compel reluctant witnesses. Travel was slow and dangerous, communication limited. For a woman who had restricted mobility and few independent resources, the task of gathering evidence across distances or against the wishes of her husband or his family was often insurmountable. Furthermore, medieval courts were often suspicious of women's testimony, particularly if it challenged male authority. A woman's word might be easily dismissed if it contradicted her husband's, especially in a society that valued female obedience. She might be accused of malicious intent, hysteria, or simply misunderstanding. The burden of not only producing evidence but also presenting it in a credible and convincing manner against a system inherently biased towards male authority was an additional layer of difficulty. Think of the practicalities. If a woman needed to interview witnesses, how would she travel to them? How would she persuade them to testify against a powerful husband or family? How would she even know what kind of evidence was needed or how to present it in a legally acceptable format? She was navigating a complex, male-dominated legal system with little to no legal training, no independent funds, and often against the direct opposition of her husband and his kin. So while the church theoretically offered a pathway to annulment, the practical reality of proving the necessary grounds was often a formidable, if not impossible, barrier. For most women, the requirement to produce irrefutable evidence for deeply personal, often hidden, or historically obscure facts meant that the doors to freedom remained firmly shut. The challenge of proving the unprovable left countless women trapped, with no legal avenue to escape unions that were, in their hearts, already broken. Number 3. The lofty spires of ecclesiastical courts. Imagine the church's formidable power in 1178. Now picture the places where its laws were enforced, the ecclesiastical courts. These were not local, easily accessible offices. These were formal, imposing institutions, often located in major towns or cathedral cities, and navigating them was a Herculean task for anyone, let alone a woman with limited resources and social standing. The very structure and nature of these courts formed another towering hurdle, making the pursuit of marital separation a distant, often impossible, dream. First and foremost, distance was a major issue. You couldn't just pop down to the local courthouse. Ecclesiastical courts operated at different levels, from archdeaconry courts to bishops' courts, and ultimately, appeals could go all the way to the Pope in Rome. For a peasant woman living in a remote village, the nearest court might be days of travel away, across difficult terrain, without safe roads or reliable transportation. Travel was not just slow, It was dangerous, exposing a lone woman to risks of robbery, assault, and exposure to the elements. Who would accompany her? Who would pay for her journey and lodging? For the vast majority of women, the sheer logistics of reaching the court were a prohibitive barrier. Then consider the expense. Pursuing a case in an ecclesiastical court was incredibly costly. There were fees for filing petitions, for summoning witnesses, for scribes to record proceedings, and for various other administrative actions. Imagine a woman, likely without independent income or property, needing to fund such an endeavor. Her family, if they were even supportive, might not have the financial means. This wasn't a system designed for the poor or the disenfranchised. It was a system for those with access to wealth and influence. For a common woman, these costs alone would immediately shut down any possibility of legal action. The process itself was incredibly slow and complex. Ecclesiastical law was intricate, full of precedents and Latin terminology. Cases could drag on for months, even years, through multiple hearings and appeals. This meant repeated travel, continuous expenses, and an ongoing drain on time and resources. A woman seeking an annulment would need to be present for these proceedings, or at least have a representative. She also had a household to run, children to care for, and daily labor to perform. She couldn't simply abandon her life to pursue a legal case that might never reach a favorable conclusion. The sheer duration of the legal process was designed to wear down petitioners, especially those with limited endurance. And speaking of representatives, women were largely barred from acting as legal counsel in their own right, and certainly not for others. While a woman might have a procurator, a male representative, to speak on her behalf, finding a competent and trustworthy one was another challenge. Legal knowledge was specialized, often held by clerics trained in canon law. These individuals would charge fees, adding to the already prohibitive costs. A woman might struggle to even understand the legal arguments being made, let alone effectively participate in them, when relying on an intermediary who might or might not fully represent her interests. The very atmosphere of the courts was intimidating. They were formal, solemn places, filled with learned men in clerical robes. Women, traditionally relegated to domestic spheres, would feel out of place and perhaps overwhelmed. The language of the court was Latin, further alienating ordinary people who spoke vernacular languages. Imagine trying to explain your personal ordeal in a foreign tongue through a male interpreter to a panel of male judges who might regard your emotional distress as irrelevant to the strict legal points at hand. Furthermore, the courts were not impartial arbitrators in the modern sense. They were part of the church, which fundamentally upheld the sacrament of marriage. The primary goal was often to preserve the marriage, or, failing that, to ensure that any annulment strictly adhered to the narrow grounds, rather than to facilitate easy exits. There was an inherent bias towards maintaining the status quo, and skepticism towards women who sought to break their marital bonds. Even if a woman somehow managed to overcome all these obstacles and present a compelling case, there was always the specter of appeal. Her husband, if he had resources, could appeal the decision to a higher court, drawing the process out even further and increasing the financial burden. Ultimate authority rested with the Pope, and an appeal to Rome was an almost mythical undertaking for anyone but the wealthiest and most powerful individuals. This meant that even a rare victory at a local level was not a guaranteed freedom. In essence, the ecclesiastical courts were designed for a different purpose than modern family courts. They were upholders of divine law and church doctrine, not facilitators of personal liberation. Their distance, expense, complexity, male-dominated nature, and inherent bias formed an almost insurmountable barrier for the average woman in 1178, making any legal path to freedom seem like a journey up a very steep and treacherous mountain. The lofty spires of these courts stood as symbols of the immense power they wielded, and of the almost impossible journey a woman would have to undertake to even approach their gates. Number 2, when abuse was just life, lack of legal protection. Imagine a world where physical and emotional suffering within a marriage was not only common, but was often considered part of the natural order of things. For women in 1178, the concept of abuse as a legal ground for marital separation, as we understand it today, simply did not exist. Instead, marital discord, even severe violence, was frequently viewed as a private family matter, a husband's right to discipline his wife, or simply an unfortunate but unavoidable aspect of life. This profound lack of legal protection left countless women utterly vulnerable and trapped in marriages that were not merely unhappy but actively dangerous. In medieval society, the husband was unequivocally the head of the household, and his authority over his wife was absolute, stemming from both secular law and religious teaching. The notion that a husband had the right, even the duty, to chastise his wife was widely accepted. This chastisement could and often did include physical violence. Legal texts and social norms of the time often permitted a husband to beat his wife, provided it was not done with a weapon and did not result in permanent injury or death. This was seen as a legitimate means of maintaining order, enforcing obedience, and correcting perceived wrongdoing. Think about the implications of this. If a woman was routinely beaten, starved, or subjected to other forms of physical cruelty by her husband, she had virtually no legal recourse. She could not approach an ecclesiastical court and argue for an annulment on the grounds of abuse. Those were not valid impediments to a marriage. Courts were concerned with the validity of the marriage vows themselves, not with the subsequent behavior of the spouses, however cruel. The church might preach against excessive violence, but it did not provide a legal mechanism for a woman to escape a marriage solely due to her husband's brutality. Even if a husband's violence was truly excessive and threatened life or limb, a woman's best hope was usually a plea to church authorities for a separation from bed and board, divortium a mensa et thoro. This was not an annulment or a divorce. It merely permitted the couple to live apart, but they remained legally married in the eyes of the church and God. Neither party could remarry. While this offered a degree of physical safety, it did not free the woman to build a new life, and it often came with severe economic consequences, as she might still be cut off from her dowry and other resources. Furthermore, securing even this limited separation was incredibly difficult, requiring strong evidence of life-threatening cruelty, and still often seen as a shameful admission of marital breakdown. The very concept of emotional abuse, or psychological cruelty, was completely unknown and certainly not a legal consideration. A wife's mental suffering, constant fear, or profound unhappiness due to a husband's tyranny, neglect, or infidelity was dismissed as private sorrow, not a matter for legal intervention. Society expected women to be patient, enduring, and resilient in the face of marital difficulties. Complaints about a husband's unkindness would likely be met with advice to pray harder, be more obedient, or simply accept her lot in life. Furthermore, there were no state or public institutions offering protection for abused women. No shelters, no domestic violence hotlines, no police forces to intervene. If a woman fled her home, she had nowhere safe to go except perhaps back to her family, who might not be willing or able to take her in, as discussed previously, due to the economic and social burdens. If she returned to her family, her husband could legally demand her return, as she was still considered his property. The shame associated with publicizing domestic violence was also a powerful deterrent. A woman who complained too loudly about her husband's treatment might be seen as disloyal, rebellious, or attempting to dishonor him. The violence was considered a private matter, and to air it publicly was to invite further scrutiny and judgment, often directed at the woman for failing to maintain peace in her home. She might be accused of provoking the violence or failing to be sufficiently submissive. Even if a woman's family was aware of the abuse, their ability to intervene was limited. They could not legally force the husband to stop, nor could they unilaterally dissolve the marriage. Their best option might be to negotiate privately with the husband, perhaps offering additional financial incentives to treat their daughter better. This relied entirely on the husband's willingness and was not a right the woman could enforce. Deeply ingrained social attitudes about male authority and female submission, combined with the lack of any legal framework to address marital cruelty, created a reality where abuse was often endured in silence. Countless women in 1178, the violent hand of their husband was just an unfortunate, but unavoidable, part of their marital existence. The legal system, far from offering protection, implicitly sanctioned this reality, leaving women trapped in unions from which there was no legal or social escape, no matter the severity of their suffering. Abuse was not a reason for divorce, it was simply life for too many. Number 1. The silence of the solitary woman. Imagine you are a woman in 1178, contemplating the unthinkable, leaving your marriage. You have faced the church's iron grip, the non-existence of divorce, the terrifying economic quicksand, the looming shadow of social ruin, the unyielding patriarchal structure, the monumental burden of proof, and the daunting, distant ecclesiastical courts, not to mention the societal acceptance of marital cruelty. Now add one more, pervasive and deeply isolating barrier, the profound silence of the solitary woman. This meant a complete absence of legal advocacy, support systems, or even a sympathetic ear within a framework designed to keep her contained. For a woman seeking separation, there was no equivalent of a modern lawyer, especially not one dedicated to women's rights or family law. Legal knowledge was specialized, often held by male clerics or noblemen, and it was certainly not readily accessible or affordable for the average woman. She could not simply consult with someone who would explain her rights, help her gather evidence, or represent her interests in court. Any representation she might secure would likely be through a male relative acting on her behalf, and even then, their primary concern might be family honor or property, not her personal well-being or freedom. The concept of a women's advocate or a feminist lawyer was centuries away. There were no female legal professionals, no organizations dedicated to helping women escape abusive marriages, and no public defenders. A woman was, by and large, on her own. She might have sympathetic friends or family members, but their ability to provide practical legal or financial assistance was severely limited. She could offer emotional support, perhaps, but not the kind of leverage needed to navigate a complex, male-dominated legal system. Moreover, a woman had very few, if any, spaces where she could speak freely and safely about her marital woes. Public gatherings were often male-dominated, and private conversations were always at risk of being overheard and gossiped about. Confession to a priest might offer spiritual guidance, but a priest, bound by church doctrine, would most likely advise reconciliation and submission, not rebellion or separation. He would remind her of her sacred vows and her duties, reinforcing the very chains she sought to break. The lack of literacy among women further compounded their isolation. Most women, especially those outside the highest noble ranks, could not read or write. This meant they couldn't consult legal texts, write petitions, or even understand official court documents. They were entirely dependent on others to convey information, which made them vulnerable to misinterpretation, manipulation, or simply being uninformed about their very limited options. This intellectual isolation was a significant barrier to self-advocacy. Think about the psychological toll. To be trapped in an unhappy or abusive marriage, with no one to turn to for effective legal or practical help, would be incredibly isolating. Constant fear of social stigma and economic destitution would force many women to internalize their suffering, to bear it in silence rather than risk public condemnation and utter ruin. This silence was not chosen, but imposed by a society that offered no viable alternative. Even if a woman had a strong personal network, their advice and support would be filtered through the prevailing societal norms. Female friends and relatives would likely have experienced similar limitations in their own lives and would advise her to endure, to pray, and to make the best of her situation, as that was the only path they knew. They wouldn't suggest legal action, because such a path was virtually non-existent or overwhelmingly fraught with peril. There were no safe houses or communal support systems for women who fled their homes. A woman leaving her husband had no recognized social space to go to. If she did not have family to take her in, her only options might be to become a vagrant, a beggar, or, in the very darkest circumstances, to resort to prostitution for survival, all paths that led to extreme poverty and total disrepute. This terrifying lack of safety net ensured that even the most desperate women would think twice, and then 100 times more, before taking such a leap into the unknown. The solitary nature of a woman's struggle was perhaps the cruelest aspect of all. She was expected to endure her marriage, whatever its nature, as her personal cross to bear. There was no collective voice, no recognized female agency, and no systemic avenue through which women could collectively challenge the marital laws or find common support. Woman's suffering was a private burden, endured in quiet desperation, far from the public eye and the possibility of intervention. The silence of the solitary woman was not merely a passive condition, it was an active reinforcement of her powerlessness. Without legal representation, Without financial independence, without social safety nets, and without a voice in the public sphere, a woman in 1178 was truly alone in her marital struggles. This profound isolation, this complete absence of external support or advocacy, solidified her entrapment, ensuring that for the vast majority, the bonds of marriage, however unbearable, remained unbreakable.